We're here because the new owners of this property asked for some information about the cemetery and how they could make it available for people to visit. The Elliots. Steve?
Come over, come on.
With a
Don't be shy.
Okay.
You wouldn't be wearing that outfit if you were shy.
good point. Steve and Bethany.
Of course,
Thank you
I
for
think.
coming, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, we have a little bit of an interesting history with this property because we've been looking for about 2 years. My sister Gail, sitting quietly over there, not wanting to be noticed, sent the listing to me at the same time my husband did from his office. And it said in the listing, this property contains or has the oldest residence of Shingle Springs on the property, and it showed a picture of Jacob Bish's grave site and, you know, beautiful pictures of the home. And it was the first property that inspired me. I was driven to come look at it after looking at all these places. I mean, I shortened my workday and drove up here for the open house. And then we shopped around and saw another one, didn't really like it. But what we ended up finding was that this was the place we should have moved to. This was definitely our new home. And the couple of details about our sort of universal connection, the spirits aligning or whatever, is that my mom had died, our mom had died just 3 months before we bought the property. And if it weren't for her, we probably couldn't have afforded to live here anyway, because she gifted us. But the first thing I saw in that cemetery was my mother's birth date is on Jacob Bish's tombstone. So that was my connection, and also a hawk watching me look at that gravesite right over in a tree. It just was an incredible experience. And then the second thing was, the only other marker is Robert McDougall, who was born in Scotland.
I wasn't born in Scotland.
So we both had this sort of, like I said, it was like the universe aligning for us to be here. There are other connections that are kind of boring, but that was the most poignant thing, I think, involving this sacred place. And we are so honored to be caretaking this area and this historic resting place. Yes, we think she's a girl. So I think that's all. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Okay, let's go back a couple years. We're sitting here, ponderosa pine, there's some oaks. A lot of the oaks are cut. You got to remember that in 1848 gold was discovered, and 90% of the people going to Coloma walked down where they hear that traffic. This was the cart trail to Coloma from Sacramento. In June of 1859, 160 years ago, the first person was buried here. His name was Chapman, Timothy Chapman. He was 75, and he was born in Canada. Up towards the post office, you know where the building with the chain link fence around it, that was the rescue store and post office, built in 1894 or 5. Right next door to it was one of the first buildings on the route from Sacramento called the Kelly Creek store. It eventually housed Francis Carpenter, the fire chief, the co-author of the rescue book that you probably have copies of, and he died of some cause. They needed a place to put him in the ground. In those days, you got in the ground in a day or two, and he was buried here. So we're sitting up here. Nothing else is here. You can look down through the trees and see the Rose Spring community. The Rose Spring house, or roadhouse, whatever you want to call it, that probably included the general store, the tavern, things like that, and then housing. Across the street was a barn, and then there was a sage-goat stop, all right down on from where Dunning hits Green Valley to the stoplight. That piece right there. And then down Dunning to Tennessee Creek. That was probably where the orchards and the gardens and everything were. This site was known for its fruits and vegetables and resupply and stuff like that. So we're here 160 years ago. We don't know where Chapman is. We know where the two sites are, where the stones are. We found two more sites a couple of weeks ago. One of them definitely, when we put the rod down, it went into space, so it went into a coffin. The other one that stopped, we're pretty sure that it was also, because these were detected because of the metal. The metal detector picked up a nail or something. The other thing we did is we pretty well knew where the schoolhouse was by some pictures of the lay of the land. Using the metal detector, there's no question where it is. There's a rectangle right out there that just went wild because of all the metal that's in the ground. So it also helps prove why this parcel is the way it is. This is a very uniquely shaped parcel. Some of the historians in here would disagree on why I think it is that shape, but I think the guy named Dunning that set this parcel up in 1947 wanted to make an acre, so he could put an acre square, which is 208 feet by 208 feet, and he couldn't include everything up on the cemetery, so he extended it up there to get everybody involved. This is one of the few sites in El Dorado County that was set up as a parcel. It is a parcel unto its own that happens to be attached to the parcel where the house is, and they're sold together, but it is two properties put together, and that's quite unique. So Chapman was buried here in June of 1859. Why did they choose the hill? Well, you stay away from a creek, because you don't want it to. You also stay away from fertile ground where they're going to plant trees or plant fruits and vegetables and stuff like that. And I think from a religious point of view, it's always nice to be on a hill. So that's why I think this site was picked. You say it's on a hill, it's on a little knob. And then, of course, when the Rose Springs community really got started in about, I forget the exact date, by a fellow named Thomas. That is not the same name that's on the plaque. Because a lot of the records were not clear in those days. I feel comfortable when we put the book together that Thomas is the one that put most of it together. He's the one that built the roads, the house, the general store, the tavern, the stagecoach, the blacksmith shop, things like that. The closest school, the communities around here, of course, the Kelly Creek store, 1850 it was built, about a half a mile west. Somerset House is about a mile northeast of here. You know where Greenstone property hits Lotus Road? There's a house just on the, looking at Greenstone, it's on the left. That was built in 1850. It was called Somerset House. Tennessee House was just across the creek. So a quarter of a mile. The closest post office was at the north, or the west end where Green Valley and Deer Valley are together. It was at the Normandy House, or Green Springs House at the time. And the closest school was built in 1853 at Jayhawk. If you know where the cemetery is, it was right in that vicinity. But they decided, another thing that is interesting, in 1860, for a year and a couple of months, the Pony Express came through here every couple of days. 1862, John Hodgkins bought the property, and they owned property down in Sacramento, but in 1861 there was a biblical flood event. 1863, there's four gentlemen that got together and said, we'd like to have our own school, something close. So they formed the Tennessee School District. Hodgkins donated a half-acre parcel right here. And they built the school late in 1863, and it burned down within months. Not an uncommon event. Lots of fires in schools and stuff like that. It was rebuilt, and then it burned down again in 1907, 43 years later. And then the school property was to revert to the owner, but it never reverted. It sat there. And the New Tennessee School was right up halfway between Ponderosa Road, which is just up the hill, and Deer Valley Road. There's a school site there, Tennessee School. And that existed until 1955, and it burned down. Okay, the second person buried up here was a gal named Cunningham. She was 18. She was a resident of the inn, or the Rose Springs house. And the third person was buried in 1864, probably about the same time as school. So the cemetery started, then the school was built. Now, by the paper we handed out, there's 19 people buried here. There could be more. There might be less, we doubt that. But this was just the local place where you couldn't have people laying around dead. It just didn't work out. Okay, in 1896 or 69, the Jacob Edgars bought the property, and about 11 years later, he built what the Edgar house is. It's pictured in the book, or in the handout. And that is, if you go Dunning and stop at the stop sign, it was 150 feet right in front of you. That's where the Dunning house property is. And the Rose Springs, the spring, is up the road towards Peaceful Garden, and there's a concrete box just offside of the road that all that water then came down, supplied water to the house until 1949. There was a lot of road alignments in here because the 100th anniversary of gold being discovered, they were going to have quite a shindig. Governor Warren was the governor then. And so a lot of these roads became straighter. Because in the old days, roads weren't straight. They were crooked so that the ox could take, the ox or the horses didn't mind walking a long distance. They just didn't want to be pulled up a hill. So they wouldn't go over hills, surely wouldn't go through it. So they just went around. So they straightened out the roads. The road that goes by Somerset House out here. If you go over there and look at that house, that piece of road was built in 1848 or 1948, in preparation for the centennial. But if you look just behind it, that's the old road. And in a lot of the old houses right here, the right-of-ways are within feet today, even today, of the center line of the road, because that's the closest route. That's where they went. Okay, Jacob owned the property until about 1945. We don't know the specific date. And then he sold it to a guy named Ray Dunning. Eventually, he lived in that same house that's pictured here with 10 children. There was that cloud. He owned hundreds of acres now, and right in the middle of it was a half-acre parcel that he didn't own. And he, because the land had never been reverted, it was on the school. So he went to, again, the co-author of the book, the rescue book, his father, who was a trustee on the Tennessee board, and they got that reverted. Then he went and, bless his heart, he then formed this parcel. And that's where we sit now. Now, the Rose Hall at Rescue, where the post office is now, that was built in 1896. It's called the Rose Springs Historical Society, Literary Society Hall. They formed this society in this schoolhouse. And that's where they met. And then when they decided, well, we got to give this thing a name, they called it Rose Springs, and that's why it's there. Now we're going to listen to Linda Van Gundy. If you have the rescue book and you can read about her, she is represents some of the more prominent rescue pioneers. Her two greats, grandfather kept diaries starting in 1861 until 1933 when he passed away. She is the keeper of those diaries. They said who died, who was sick, how much gold they got that day, and what the weather was. So, Linda's going to tell us about some of the people that are right behind us here.
I just have to say, I'm so impressed there's so many people here and that you cared to come today, because you guys just don't know. You're in a center of a great deal of rich history right here, and these people lived the history. They lived it, and so it's really important that we acknowledge them. You know, you all know that thousands and thousands of people came to California for the gold rush. Some of them settled here, some of them stayed here, some of them ended up going back home to the East Coast or whatever country they came from. A lot of these people did stay here. These families, if you happen to read Bill's book, they intermarried. You'll see names over and over and over again, and I'm kind of a result of that. I have to admit, I have five branches of my family tree came here in from 1849 to 1850 and settled in this area. So we don't all end up retarded or anything. Anyways, they did. These people built these towns. They had stores. They had these motels. They had these schools. They had their claims. They built homes. This was their community. This is what they wanted to make a success, even though some of them weren't successful in the mining. And it's important that we don't forget them. It's our obligation to remember these people. Oftentimes, the only thing that's left, not only just of the town, but of any remembrance of these people, are the cemeteries. A lot of these people, if you read old Mountain Democrats or old Folsom Telegraphs or old Sacramento Daily Union newspapers, you'll see ads in the papers, and they'll say things like, looking for information about John Smith, left Boston, Massachusetts, whatever date, 1849, last known to be in Placerville, 1851. And these articles are like 1870, 1860, 1880. Their families are looking for them. They don't know what happened to them. They came out here, and for whatever reason, they didn't communicate with people back home. Maybe they met an untimely death right after they got here. They didn't know people. So this is where a lot of them end up, and this is the last trails that we can find of them. So it's up to us to really acknowledge them. And a lot of our old cemeteries, they're lost to time. They become overgrown, roots disrupt the graves. People that used to tend the graves, the family members, if there are family members, quit coming, they move away, they might die. So these old cemeteries just aren't tended to. So I'm just so happy that you guys have decided to preserve this. So I'm going to tell you about 4 people that are buried in this cemetery. A lot of these people met untimely deaths. They got illnesses. They had accidents. They might have had a violent death. You know, it's just different ways that they died. So I'm going to tell you about the 4 people. One died by an accident when he was 41 years old. One contracted an illness and expired when he was 67 years old. One ended his own life when he was 46 years old. And then, of course, I had to include a woman, you know. And so she's the most well-documented person that I'm going to talk to you about today, the most well-documented person that's buried behind us. And I'm actually a relative of hers, so I have a lot of information about her. First person I'm going to tell you about is Lewis Cole. Lewis Cole was born in Virginia in 1813, so a long time ago. He died in 1882. He's an example, to me, of a lot of things I see documented in my great-great-grandfather's journals. Because you often hear about people that came out here and they died, and they were just left to die. People didn't remember them, they didn't know who they were, and a lot of times you hear that they just buried them and walked away. Well, in this community, I have to say, the actual first-hand documentation does not show that. It shows that these people tended their neighbors when they were sick. They'd go into Placerville and they would buy food or prescriptions or whatever. They'd spend the night with them to tend to the night, and then they'd go out and mine their claims. You know, they really did try to take care of each other. I think that Lewis Cole is an example of that because there's very, very little information that I've been able to find about him, other than he listed his occupation in census records as a miner. And when he wasn't heard from for a number of days, his friends, quote unquote his friends, went to his cabin to check on him. And this is what the Mountain Democrat said about that. It says, some friends visited the cabin of Lewis Cole at Dry Creek near Rose Springs. They found Mr. Cole on his bed, paralyzed, unable to help himself on Thursday. He became insensible on Saturday, and he died. They were going to call the coroner to come in, and then his friends decided it wasn't necessary. It was obviously that he had had an illness, he was paralyzed, and that what caused his death. So these friends took his remains here, and they buried him. They actually did notice that they tended the grave for a number of years. No note of any family ever being involved in his death. The next person I'm going to tell you about is James Wing. James Wing and his brother John were instrumental in settling the whole White Oak Township area. James maintained a toll road and owned the El Dorado Branch House on Green Valley Road. He's actually documented as being very well-to-do. He was never married, had no known children. When he died, his will, when it was administered by his brother. So I'm not really sure what happened to him, because in his will he actually left. He had a lot of animals. He had calves. He had horses. He had buggies. He had wagons. He had land. He was a considerably well-to-do man for this area. But this is what the obituary for him says. It was in the Sacramento Daily Union, March 10th of 1870. He was in his home, and Wing was found lying in bed. The corpse and its surroundings presented a terrible appearance from the quantity of blood from which he was covered. Appearances indicated that the deceased had deliberately committed suicide, though from what motive appears to be unknown. Previous to committing the deed, he had undressed himself and got into bed. He rolled up his pants and placed them on one of his legs to rest the butt of his old Jaeger rifle. He then placed the muzzle of the gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger with his toe. The result was doubtless almost instantaneously fatal. The charge came coming out of the top of his head. So it's pretty sad to know that he had a lot of things going in his favor, but obviously something very tragic was happening in his life. So he was buried here. I'm going to talk about Robert McDougall. Robert McDougall was born in Scotland. Various dates in the census. Censuses aren't always our best reference for things, but anywhere from 1829 to 1834 is his listed birth. He died in 1876. He was a sailor, known to have sailed from Scotland to Australia, Australia to the United States. It was when he was in Boston, Massachusetts, that he met up with one of my relatives, Robert Macbeth. And Robert Macbeth had been in Australia, had come to the United States to visit his sister in Boston. She, obviously she was from Scotland also, and she was a Macbeth who married into the Williamson family, which is another name you'll hear a lot around this area. When Robert Macbeth was there and he met his friend Robert McDougall, that is when they heard about the discovery of gold in California. So they decided they were going to set out, come to California. So they did come to California, mine together. Meanwhile, Robert Macbeth's brother, James Macbeth, had also a sailor, had been in Australia. He had decided to stay in Australia. When he was in Australia, he met a woman. He was there for about a year, and then his brother got a hold of him. His brother went back to Australia, got the brother, so James and Robert Macbeth, their brothers, came back, met up with McDougall, and then they all three came to California on a ship. And so they were riding partners down outside of Coloma. Okay. Robert and James Macbeth had a niece. Her name was Catherine. And she met Robert McDougall in Boston. They kind of, got to know each other and they liked each other. And then when Robert came on to California, he kind of forgot about her, it seems, because all of a sudden, when the Macbeth brothers received a picture of her, Robert McDougall, in interviews later in the newspaper by family members, was known to have said, "Oh, my gosh, that's the woman I'm going to marry." So his story was that when he was still in Scotland, he had gone to a fortune teller, and the fortune teller had described this woman in this specific print of a dress. Well, he believed that this description fit Catherine in this picture, and that the print of the material was the dress that this woman had identified, this fortune teller had identified. So he went back to Boston, met up with Catherine, and married her back there, and brought her out here. So that's how she got here. So the Macbeth brothers and McDougall kind of split up. McDougall got his own little claim and house, and that's where he planted Catherine. And then the Macbeth brothers had their property. Well, something happened with the Macbeth brothers. There was an argument. So they went and did their different ways, both staying in Dorado County. And then Robert McDougall proceeded to do pretty well. He did okay. He wasn't, one of the wealthier people here, but he was able to support his family. He's my example of dying in a miner's accident, because his obituary from the Sacramento Daily Union of September 8, 1876 says that he went to work this morning as usual. He was in good spirits. He was of a jovial nature. Failing to return home, his lunch meal, which was his usual custom, his wife and family became alarmed. They began their search, and then they notified neighbors that they could not find him. His nearly lifeless body remains were found, a large boulder having fallen upon them. He was able, however, to crawl a few yards from his claim, and when he was found, he was breathing his last breath. So he did die there. He was respected by all who knew him, and his wife and family were given the very big financial support and emotional support from this community. So then there's Catherine. Catherine, I could probably talk to you all day about Catherine. There's just so much information. She was a very remarkable woman. So I have this picture of Catherine that I found in a newspaper, and I'm going to pass it around because I want you all to look at her and think, gosh, she could be my grandma. She just looks like such a sweet little lady. So this is Catherine. Catherine was born in Scotland in 1841. She died here, or actually she died in Bakersfield and was reinterred here in 1930. She came to America aboard the ship Monument. And the ship manifest documents that she arrived in New York City August 7th of 1843. She traveled with her 21-year-old mother, no man. So they left Scotland on a ship, a 21-year-old woman and a small child. And we all know that could be very challenging, I'm sure. So they were in New York, and then she said in later life interviews before she died that she in 1859 was able to see the Prince of Wales when he came to New York, who was later King Edward, so quite an accomplishment. She also saw, as she was waiting to board the ship to come to California in 1861, she saw Abraham Lincoln as he was on his way to his inauguration. So they came to California, sailing around the Horn, the two of them, and settled in El Dorado County. In El Dorado County, she was very prominent in a lot of civic groups. I know some of us think we're really involved, but she was really involved in a lot of children's groups and women's rights groups in Placerville. She was known to entertain James Marshall in her home. She was actually on a speaking engagement with Mark Twain, and she knew Edward Markham. She was a very well-educated woman. She died of myocarditis and bronchial pneumonia, and she died in Bakersfield. That's where her family had relocated. Although she's documented in the Mountain Democrat newspaper of coming back to Placerville a lot to visit the sites, the scenes, and the people that were still alive. So she kept her contact with this area. When she was eulogized in Bakersfield, she was eulogized as a pioneer woman held in high esteem and affection by all those who knew her. So You know, I guess my story is, of all these cemeteries, is that, you know, you look at these and you think, gosh, what kind of lives did these people live? Some of them had very rich lives, some of them had very tragic lives, some of them had very short lives. And a lot of these little cemeteries, I know I came up here a couple years ago when we came, Bill. It was 2 or 3 years ago we came up and
A little longer than
and tried to like clean up around these, you know, they're lost to time. And so I'm just so impressed that you guys have decided to take the commitment that you've made. So, thank you.